Sometimes the people who have lost everything are the ones who understand love best. Sometimes the strongest hearts are found in the most broken places. Genevieve Ashcroft has everything money can buy, but nothing that matters. Her vineyard estate sits beautiful and empty, just like her life since the war took her husband and son. Then one morning, a giant cowboy appears at her gate with his hat in his hands, asking for work. Eli Creed is a man running from his past, carrying secrets that weigh heavier than the stones he moves. He works her land with gentle hands and asks for nothing more than a place to sleep and food to eat. But as harvest season approaches, something grows between them that neither expected. When danger threatens her estate, Genevieve must decide if she can trust the mysterious man who showed up with nothing but his strength and his word. Will a lonely widow finally open her heart to the one man strong enough to protect what matters most? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of the Ashcroft Manor, casting delicate shadows across the polished hardwood floors. Genevieve stood at the tall windows of her sitting room, watching the sun paint the rolling hills of Willow Ridge in shades of gold and amber. Below her, the vineyard stretched endless row upon row of carefully tended vines that had been her family's pride for 3 generations. At 42, Genevieve possessed the kind of beauty that deepened with time rather than faded. Her auburn hair, now touched with silver at the temples, was pulled back in an elegant chignon. Her green eyes held intelligence and sorrow in equal measure, and her posture spoke of a woman who had learned to carry herself with dignity even when the world had taken everything she loved. The house around her was a testament to prosperity: Persian rugs, oil paintings in gilded frames, furniture imported from back east. Yet for all its grandeur, it felt hollow. The silence was broken only by the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the distant sounds of the workers beginning their day in the fields. 3 years had passed since the telegram arrived. 3 years since she learned that her husband Thomas and their son Michael would never return from the war. Thomas had volunteered despite being past the age of necessity, driven by duty and honor. Michael, barely 18, had followed his father's example with the eagerness of youth who believes himself invincible. The family portrait on the mantelpiece captured them in happier times. Thomas with his confident smile and steady gaze, Michael with his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, and Genevieve between them, radiant with the contentment of a woman who believed her world was secure. Now dust had settled on the glass, and she could barely bring herself to look at it. Her daily routine had become a careful structure designed to fill the emptiness. She woke at dawn, dressed in practical clothes that befitted a woman managing a large estate, and reviewed the vineyard's operations with her foreman, Jacob. The man had worked for her family for 20 years, and his weathered face showed the same respect he had always given, tinged now with gentle concern for her well-being. "The north fields are ready for pruning, ma'am," Jacob would report, his German accent still thick after decades in America. "And the new barrels arrived yesterday from the cooperage." Genevieve would nod, ask pertinent questions, and make decisions with the same precision she had learned from watching her husband. The vineyard continued to prosper under her management, perhaps even more so than before. Without Thomas's occasional impulses toward experimentation, she had focused on perfecting what they knew worked well. The workers treated her with a mixture of respect and careful distance. She was their employer, a woman of means who paid fairly and on time, but she was also a widow who had retreated into herself. They tipped their hats when she passed, answered her questions with polite deference, and left her to her solitude. Martha, the housekeeper who had been with the family for 15 years, tried her best to bridge the gap. A stout woman with kind eyes and gentle hands, she would bring tea without being asked, and linger to discuss household matters that could have been settled in moments. "You need to eat more, Mrs. Ashcroft," Martha would say, noting the barely touched breakfast tray. "You're getting too thin." But Genevieve found little pleasure in food, in music, in reading in all the things that had once brought her joy. She moved through her days with efficiency and purpose, but without the warmth that had once defined her. The estate itself seemed to reflect her state of mind. The gardens, once her pride, were maintained but lacked the loving touches that had made them extraordinary. The house was clean and orderly, but felt more like a museum than a home. Even the vineyard, for all its continued success, seemed to operate on momentum rather than passion. It was on a Tuesday morning in late June when everything changed. Genevieve was in the estate office, reviewing the books and planning the harvest schedule, when she heard voices outside. Through the window, she saw Jakob speaking with a man she didn't recognize as a tall, broad-shouldered figure whose presence seemed to dwarf even her sturdy foreman. The stranger wore clothes that spoke of long travel and hard use. His boots were worn but well-maintained, his pants and shirt clean but faded from sun and washing. What struck her most was his stillness, the way he stood with his hat in his hands, head slightly bowed, waiting patiently for Jakob to finish speaking. When Jakob gestured toward the house, the man looked up, and even from a distance, Genevieve could see the weathered lines of his face, the careful way he held himself. There was something in his bearing that suggested strength held in check, power tempered by restraint. She watched as Jakob led the stranger toward the house, curiosity overriding her usual desire for solitude. It had been months since anyone new had come to Willow Ridge, and she found herself wondering what brought this man to her door. The knock came softly, and Martha's voice followed. "Mrs. Ashcroft, there's a gentleman here about work." Genevieve straightened her dress and checked her appearance in the small mirror above her desk. She had learned to present herself with authority when dealing with potential workers. It established the proper boundaries from the beginning. "Send him in, Martha." The door opened, and the man entered, hat still in his hands. Up close, he was even more imposing than she had expected. He stood well over 6 feet, with shoulders that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. His hair was dark brown, touched with grey at the temples, and his face bore the deep tan of someone who lived under the open sky. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, a deep brown that held both wariness and something else she couldn't quite identify. They were eyes that had seen too much, yet retained a capacity for gentleness that seemed at odds with his rough appearance. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and respectful. "Name's Eli Creed. Your foreman said you might have need of another hand." His accent placed him from somewhere further west, and there was a careful quality to his speech that suggested education beneath the cowboy exterior. He stood perfectly still, not fidgeting or showing any of the nervous energy that other job seekers often displayed. "What kind of work are you looking for, Mr. Creed?" she asked, settling behind her desk to maintain the proper distance. "Any kind you need done, ma'am. I'm good with horses, can mend fences, handle heavy lifting. Been working ranches and farms most of my life." He paused, then added with quiet dignity, "I don't drink to excess, I don't cause trouble, and I work hard for my pay." There was something in the way he said it that made her believe him. She had interviewed dozens of men over the years, and she had learned to read the signs, the ones who promised more than they could deliver, the ones who would disappear after their first pay, the ones who looked at her with calculation rather than respect. This man was different. He stood there with his hat in his hands, asking for work with the same humility she might have expected from someone asking for charity. Yet there was strength in his bearing, competence in the way he carried himself. "We pay standard wages," she said, testing him, "room and board in the workers' quarters, Sundays off, unless there's an emergency." "That's fair, ma'am. You understand that I run this operation, and my word is final." "Yes, ma'am." She studied his face, looking for any sign of the subtle condescension she had encountered from other men, who found it difficult to take orders from a woman. She found none. "Jakob will show you to your quarters and explain your duties," she said finally. "You'll start tomorrow at dawn." "Thank you, ma'am. I'm grateful for the opportunity." He turned to go, then paused at the door. "Ma'am, I want you to know that I understand this is your home, and I respect that. You won't have any trouble from me." After he left, Genevieve sat in her chair for a long moment, trying to understand why the encounter had unsettled her. It wasn't fear she had felt safe enough, even alone with a strange man. It was something else, a stirring of curiosity that she hadn't felt in years. Through the window, she watched him follow Jakob toward the workers' quarters. There was something about the way he moved, the careful control in his stride, that suggested he was holding back much more than he showed. She found herself wondering what had brought him to Willow Ridge, what story lay behind those watchful eyes. That evening, as she sat alone in her dining room with Martha's excellent dinner growing cold before her, she realized she was looking forward to tomorrow in a way she hadn't in years. For the first time since the telegram, something had pierced through the careful routine of her days. She dismissed the feeling as mere curiosity about a new worker, but as she prepared for bed, she found herself wondering if Eli Creed would prove to be as good as his word. And deep in her heart, in a place she had thought permanently closed, she wondered if his presence might somehow change the careful emptiness she had built around herself. Outside her window, the vineyard stretched into the darkness, and somewhere in the workers' quarters, a new presence had joined the quiet community of Willow Ridge. Tomorrow would bring the first test of whether her instincts about the mysterious cowboy had been correct. The storm came without warning on Eli's third day at Willow Ridge, rolling across the valley like a grey wall of fury. Genevieve woke to the sound of wind rattling the windows and rain hammering against the roof with the intensity of bullets. She dressed quickly and hurried downstairs, her heart racing with the familiar panic that came whenever nature threatened her vineyard. Through the kitchen window, she could see the workers running for shelter as the storm unleashed its full power. The carefully tended vines bent nearly horizontal under the assault, and she watched in horror as a section of fence near the north field splintered and collapsed under the weight of a falling oak branch. "Mrs. Ashcroft," Martha called from the hallway. "Jacob's here says we need to secure the equipment barn before the roof goes." Genevieve grabbed her rain slicker and boots, her mind already calculating the potential damage. A storm like this could destroy a season's work in minutes, could set the vineyard back years if it hit the most vulnerable sections. She had weathered storms before, but always with Thomas and the full crew. Now she felt the weight of responsibility pressing down like the dark clouds overhead. She burst through the kitchen door into the maelstrom, immediately soaked despite her rain gear. The wind was so strong she had to lean into it to make progress toward the barn where Jakob was directing the workers in moving equipment to safety. "How bad is it?" she shouted over the howling wind. "Bad enough," Jakob replied, his face grim with concern. "The north fence is down, and I'm worried about the new plantings near the creek. If it floods—" His words were cut off by a tremendous crack as another tree gave way, this one taking out a section of the equipment barn's roof. Tools and supplies scattered across the yard, and Genevieve watched helplessly as expensive machinery was pelted by hail that had begun to fall like frozen fists. That was when she saw him. Eli Creed was running toward the collapsed section, not away from it, his massive frame cutting through the storm as if the wind was merely an inconvenience. Without hesitation, he began dragging equipment to safety, his movements efficient and purposeful despite the chaos around him. "Eli," she called, but her voice was lost in the storm. She started toward him, but Jacob caught her arm. "Too dangerous, ma'am. That roof could come down completely." But Eli seemed oblivious to the danger. He had organized several of the younger workers into a chain, passing tools and supplies from the damaged barn to the safety of the main building. When a massive beam began to sag ominously overhead, he didn't retreat instead. He positioned himself to catch it, using his shoulders and back to support the weight while the others cleared the remaining equipment. Genevieve watched in amazement as this man she barely knew risked his own safety to protect her property. There was something almost heroic in the way he moved, as if he had faced storms like this before and knew exactly what needed to be done. The worst of the storm passed after 2 hours, leaving behind a landscape transformed by wind and water. The damage was extensive: fences down, trees fallen across the access roads, The equipment barn partially collapsed. But as Genevieve surveyed the destruction, she realized it could have been much worse without Eli's quick thinking and leadership. She found him near the north field, already working to clear debris from the broken fence line. His clothes were soaked through, his hair plastered to his head, but he moved with steady determination, as if the storm had been merely an interruption in his day's work. "Mr. Creed," she called as she approached. He looked up, his brown eyes meeting hers, with that same careful respect she had noticed during their first meeting. "Ma'am, checking on the damage." "I wanted to thank you," she said, surprised by the emotion in her own voice. "What you did back to resaving the equipment that was above and beyond what any worker should be expected to do." He straightened, wiping his hands on his wet shirt. "Storm's no respecter of persons, ma'am. Seemed like the right thing to do." For the first time, she really looked at him not as an employer evaluating a worker, but as a person seeing another person. His hands, she noticed, were scarred and calloused from years of hard work, but they moved with surprising gentleness as he examined the broken fence posts. When he spoke, his voice carried a quiet authority that made the other workers listen and follow his suggestions without question. "This fence," he said, running his hand along the splintered wood, "it's not just storm damage. These posts were already weakening. See here." He pointed to the base of one post, where the wood showed signs of rot. "Been compromised for a while. Storm just finished what time started." Genevieve knelt beside him, following his gaze. She had walked this fence line countless times, but had never noticed the subtle signs of decay he was pointing out. "How did you see that?" "Spent a lot of time fixing things that were broken," he said simply. "You learn to look for the problems underneath the problems." There was something in the way he said it that made her think he wasn't just talking about fence posts. She found herself studying his profile as he worked, noting the careful concentration in his expression, the way his large hands could handle the delicate work of examining damaged wood with surprising precision. "Can it be repaired?" she asked. "Better to replace it entirely," he said, standing and brushing the dirt from his knees. "Do it right the first time, and it'll hold for 20 years. Patch it now, and you'll be fixing it again next season." The practical wisdom in his words reminded her of something Thomas might have said, and the memory caught her off guard. For 3 years, she had been making decisions alone, relying on Jakob's experience and her own determination. But here was someone who seemed to understand both the immediate problem and its long-term implications. "What would you need to do the job properly?" she heard herself asking. Eli looked at her with surprise, as if he hadn't expected to be consulted on planning rather than just execution. Good cedar posts, proper hardware, and time to dig the holes deep enough. Maybe 3 days' work with a full crew. "Then do it," she said, "whatever you need." As they walked back toward the house, Genevieve found herself stealing glances at the man beside her. There was something about the way he moved, the quiet confidence in his bearing, that made her feel safer than she had in years. When he spoke, it was with the measured cadence of someone who thought before he opened his mouth, and his suggestions showed a depth of knowledge that went far beyond what she had expected from a wandering cowboy. That evening, as she sat in her study reviewing the storm damage and planning repairs, she kept thinking about the moment when Eli had positioned himself under that falling beam. He could have been seriously injured, even killed, but he hadn't hesitated to put himself at risk for her property for her. The realization unsettled her. She had grown accustomed to being alone, to handling crises through her own determination and the loyal but distant support of her long-term employees. But today, for the first time since Thomas's death, she had felt like someone was truly looking out for her interests, protecting what mattered to her. She tried to dismiss the feeling as gratitude for good work, but something deeper was stirring a recognition that Eli Creed was not just another hired hand. The way he had taken charge during the storm, the respect the other workers had shown him, the careful intelligence in his assessment of the fence damage, all of it suggested a man with experience and capabilities far beyond what his humble request for work had indicated. As she prepared for bed, she found herself looking forward to tomorrow's work in a way that surprised her. For the first time in 3 years, she wouldn't be facing a challenge entirely alone. Somewhere in the workers' quarters, a man who had proven himself willing to stand between her and disaster was planning how to make her vineyard stronger than before. The thought should have been merely comforting, but instead it stirred something she had thought buried with Tomasa, sense of partnership, of shared purpose, of not having to carry every burden by herself. Outside her window, the repaired fence line would soon stand as testament to both the storm's power and their ability to weather it together. But Genevieve was beginning to suspect that the real change at Willow Ridge had nothing to do with broken wood and everything to do with the quiet strength of the man who had arrived just days before the storm, as if he had somehow known he would be needed. The days following the storm fell into a rhythm that surprised Genevieve with its comfort. Each morning, she would find Eli already at work before dawn, his movements purposeful and quiet in the grey light that preceded sunrise. He approached each task with the same careful attention he had shown during the crisis, whether he was replacing fence posts or tending to the more delicate work of vine maintenance. What struck her most was his gentleness with the living things on the estate. She had grown accustomed to workers who saw the vineyard as a job, who did their assigned tasks competently but without any real connection to the land. Eli was different. She watched him work among the vines with something approaching reverence, his large hands moving with surprising delicacy as he adjusted supports or removed damaged leaves. It was on the 4th morning after the storm that she discovered something that changed her perception of him entirely. She had risen early to check on the progress of the fence repairs and was walking through the stable yard when she heard a sound that stopped her in her tracks, a low, melodic humming coming from one of the stalls. Following the sound, she peered around the corner and saw Eli kneeling beside a young foal that had been injured during the storm. The little horse lay on its side, its left rear leg wrapped in careful bandages, while Eli stroked its neck with infinite patience. But it was what he was singing that made her heart catch. In a voice surprisingly warm and rich, he was humming a lullaby, same one she had sung to Michael when he was small, the same melody that Thomas had hummed while working in his study late at night. "Hush now, little one," Eli murmured to the foal, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're going to be just fine. That leg will heal strong, and you'll be running with your mama again before you know it." The foal's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, and its breathing seemed to calm under his gentle touch. Genevieve found herself frozen in place, watching this display of tenderness from a man whose size and weathered appearance suggested nothing but strength and hardness. "The storm scared you, didn't it?" Eli continued, his hands never stopping their gentle motion. "I know something about being scared. Sometimes the world feels like it's falling down around you, and you don't know if you're strong enough to stand back up." The words were spoken to the foal, but Genevieve felt them resonate in her own chest. She thought of the nights she had lain awake after receiving the telegram, wondering if she had the strength to keep going, to keep the vineyard alive, to honor Thomas and Michael's memory by succeeding where they could no longer help. "But here's what I learned," Eli said, his voice carrying a depth of experience that spoke of hard-won wisdom. "Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is let somebody help you. Sometimes healing happens best when you're not trying to do it all alone." The foal whinnied softly and tried to lift its head. Eli supported it gently, helping it find a more comfortable position. "That's it. Take it slow. Nobody's expecting you to be running races today." Genevieve realized she was holding her breath, afraid to break the spell of this unexpected intimacy. She had never seen a man tend to an injured animal with such care, had never heard someone speak to a wounded creature with the kind of understanding that suggested personal familiarity with pain and healing. When Eli began to sing again, a soft, wordless melody that seemed to wrap around the foal like a blanket, she felt tears prick at her eyes. The song was hauntingly beautiful, filled with both sorrow and hope, and she found herself thinking of all the nights she had wished for someone to sing away her own fears. "Mrs. Ashcroft." She startled, realizing that Eli had noticed her presence. His brown eyes met hers across the stable, and for a moment neither of them spoke. She felt caught, exposed in her eavesdropping, but instead of the embarrassment she expected, she felt only a strange sense of connection. "I'm sorry," she said, stepping into the stall. "I heard the singing and—" She paused, looking down at the injured foal. "How is he doing?" Eli corrected gently, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "And she's doing better. The leg wasn't broken, just badly bruised. She'll need rest and careful tending, but she should recover completely." Genevieve knelt beside him, studying the foal's peaceful expression. Under Eli's care, the little animal seemed calm, trusting, no longer fighting against the pain, but accepting the help being offered. "You have a gift with animals," she observed. Eli shrugged, but she caught a faint flush of color in his weathered cheeks. "Spent a lot of time around horses. They're honest creatures. They don't pretend to be something they're not, and they don't ask for more than kindness and respect." There was something in the way he said it that made her wonder if he found honesty in short supply among humans. She watched his hands as he checked the foal's bandages, noting the careful precision of his movements, the way the young horse responded to his touch without fear. "Where did you learn to do that?" she asked. "The bandaging, I mean. You wrapped that leg as well as any veterinarian." For a moment, his hands stilled, and she saw something flicker across his face, shadow of memory that he quickly suppressed. "You pick things up when you're traveling," he said finally. "Animals get hurt, and sometimes there's no doctor around." It was clearly not the whole truth, but she sensed that pushing for more would only make him retreat into the careful politeness he showed most of the time. Instead, she reached out tentatively and stroked the foal's neck, marveling at how soft the fur was under her fingers. "My son loved horses," she said quietly, surprised by her own words. She rarely spoke of Michael to anyone, but something about this quiet moment invited confidences. He was planning to breed them when he got back from the war, said he wanted to raise the finest horses in California. Eli's hands resumed their gentle work, but she could tell he was listening. "He sounds like he had good dreams." He did. The words came easier now, released by the peaceful atmosphere of the stable and the presence of someone who seemed to understand the value of gentleness. He was so young, so full of plans for the future. Sometimes I think the hardest part isn't that he's gone, it's that all those dreams died with him. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, both of them tending to the foal with shared purpose. Genevieve found herself stealing glances at Eli's face, noting the concentration in his expression, the way his mouth curved slightly when the foal responded positively to their care. "Dreams don't always die," he said eventually, his voice thoughtful. "Sometimes they just get passed on to different hands. Maybe this little one will grow up to be the kind of horse your son would have been proud to raise." The simple wisdom in his words touched something deep in her chest. For 3 years, she had thought of Michael's unfulfilled dreams as another loss to grieve. But Eli's perspective offered a different way of seeing it, not as an ending, but as a possibility waiting for the right moment to bloom again. When they finally left the stable, the foal was resting comfortably, and Genevieve felt lighter than she had in months. As they walked toward the house for breakfast, she found herself wanting to know more about this man, who could sing lullabies to injured animals and speak with such understanding about dreams deferred. "Thank you," she said as they reached the kitchen door. "For what, ma'am?" "For caring about her, for taking the time to do it right." She paused, then added more quietly, "For showing me that gentleness isn't the same thing as weakness." Eli stopped walking and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "No, ma'am," he said finally. "Sometimes it takes more strength to be gentle than it does to be hard." As she watched him walk away toward the workers' quarters, Genevieve realized that Eli Creed was teaching her things she hadn't known she needed to learn. And for the first time since the storm, she was beginning to wonder if his arrival at Willow Ridge had been more than mere coincidence. In the weeks that followed, Genevieve found herself paying more attention to the details of vineyard operations than she had in years. It wasn't that she had been neglecting her responsibilities, quite the opposite. But Eli's presence seemed to sharpen her focus, making her notice improvements and possibilities that had previously escaped her attention. The most obvious changes were practical ones. The new fence line he had built was not only stronger than what had come before, but more elegant, with posts that showed evidence of careful craftsmanship. When she complimented him on the work, he had simply nodded and mentioned that his father had been a carpenter, as if artistry was something that came naturally with the trade. But it was the smaller touches that impressed her most. She discovered hand-carved stakes throughout the vineyard, each one shaped from local oak and designed to support the vines without damaging the delicate tendrils. When she asked Jakob about them, he had shrugged and said, "Eli made them in the evenings. Says the metal ones we've been using are too harsh for the young growth." Genevieve found one of the stakes and examined it closely. The wood had been shaped with obvious skill, smooth to the touch, and carved with a subtle pattern that was both functional and beautiful. Each stake was slightly different, as if Eli had taken the time to consider the individual needs of each vine. The discovery led her to pay closer attention to his other work. She noticed that he had reorganized the tool shed with an efficiency that saved time and reduced waste. He had repaired equipment that others had written off as broken, and he had suggested improvements to their irrigation system that would conserve water while ensuring better coverage. Most surprisingly, he had begun working with the newer employees, teaching them techniques and sharing knowledge with the same patient manner he had shown with the injured foal. She watched from her office window as he demonstrated proper pruning methods to a young man who had been struggling with the delicate work, his large hands showing exactly how to make clean cuts that would encourage healthy growth. The other workers had initially been wary of the newcomer, as was natural in any close-knit community, but Eli's combination of competence and humility had quickly won their respect. He never claimed credit for improvements, never criticized existing methods without offering better alternatives, and he worked harder than anyone else without complaint. It was Martha who first mentioned the change in atmosphere around the estate. "Place feels different," the housekeeper observed one evening as she prepared dinner. "More like it used to when your husband was alive, purposeful, you know. Like everyone's working towards something instead of just keeping things from falling apart." Genevieve knew exactly what Martha meant. For 3 years, the vineyard had operated in a kind of holding pattern, maintaining its success but lacking the forward momentum that had characterized Thomas's management. Now she sensed a renewed energy among the workers, a feeling that they were building towards something rather than simply preserving what had come before. The shift was evident in their evening meetings, when she would review the day's progress with Jakob and plan for tomorrow's tasks. Increasingly, these conversations included input from Eli, who had proven to have insights that went far beyond basic labor. "The vines in the south section are stressed," he reported one evening, his hat in his hands as always when he spoke with her. "Too much direct sun without enough moisture retention. Might want to consider planting cover crops between the rows." Cover crops? Genevieve had heard the term but wasn't familiar with the practical application. "Clover, maybe some native grasses," Eli explained. "They'll hold moisture in the soil and provide nutrients when they decompose. My father used the technique on his small vineyard back in Missouri, increased his yield by nearly 20%. She found herself leaning forward, interested despite herself. "Your father was a vintner." For a moment, Eli's careful composure slipped, and she saw something vulnerable flicker across his face. "Small operation, nothing like this." But he understood the land, understood how to work with it instead of against it. There was clearly more to the story, but as usual, Eli didn't elaborate. Instead, he focused on the practical details of implementing the cover crop strategy, explaining the timing and techniques with the kind of knowledge that came from hands-on experience. Over the following days, Genevieve found herself seeking out these conversations. She would join him in the fields during his morning rounds, ostensibly to oversee the work, but increasingly because she valued his perspective on the challenges they faced. "You're thinking like a manager," he observed one morning as they examined a section of vines that had been damaged by insects. "Sometimes it helps to think like the vines instead." "What do you mean?" Eli knelt, and touched the soil at the base of one plant, rubbing the earth between his fingers. "They're telling you what they need, if you know how to listen. This soil is too compact, roots can't spread properly. These leaves are yellowing because they're not getting enough nutrients. The vines are working harder than they should have to just to survive." As he spoke, she found herself seeing the vineyard through different eyes. Instead of rows of agricultural products, she began to notice individual plants with specific needs and characteristics. Eli taught her to read the subtle signs of stress or health, to understand how changes in weather or soil conditions affected the vine's behavior. "My husband always said the land would tell you what it needed," she said one afternoon, as they worked together to thin, overcrowded grape clusters. "But I never really learned how to listen." "It takes time," Eli replied, his hands gentle as he removed excess fruit to allow the remaining grapes to develop properly. "And most people are too busy talking to hear what the land is saying." There was something almost meditative about working beside him. His presence seemed to slow time, to create space for the kind of careful attention that quality required. She found herself staying in the fields longer than necessary, drawn by the peaceful rhythm of shared labor and the comfortable silences that required no filling. It was during one of these quiet afternoons that she realized how much her daily routine had changed. For 3 years, she had managed the vineyard with efficient competence, making decisions and giving orders from a necessary distance. Now she was working with her hands again, feeling the texture of soil and leaves, participating in the physical care of the vines, instead of simply directing others to do it. The change was evident in her appearance as well. Her clothes showed honest dirt from field work, her hands were stained with earth and grape juice, and her hair often escaped its neat arrangement by the end of the day. Instead of feeling unprofessional, she felt more connected to the land than she had since Thomas's death. "You're enjoying this," Eli observed one evening as they finished tying new growth to the support wires. She looked up, surprised by the direct comment. "What makes you say that?" "You smile when you work with the vines," he said simply. "Didn't used to." The observation caught her off guard. She hadn't realized that her emotional state was so visible, or that Eli had been paying close enough attention to notice the change. The knowledge that he had been watching her not as an employer, but as a person stirred something warm and unfamiliar in her chest. As they walked back toward the house in the gathering dusk, Genevieve found herself stealing glances at the man beside her. His steady presence had become a comfort she looked forward to, and his insights had reminded her why she had fallen in love with vineyard life in the first place. But more than that, Eli had shown her a way of being in the world that combined strength with gentleness, competence with humility. In his company, she felt more like herself than she had in years, not just the widow, struggling to maintain her husband's legacy, but a woman capable of growth and discovery. The realization should have worried her, but instead it filled her with a sense of anticipation that had been missing from her life for far too long. Whatever was happening between them, it felt like the beginning of something important, something worth nurturing, with the same patience and care that Eli brought to everything he touched. The evening air carried the sweet scent of ripening grapes as Genevieve and Eli finished their work in the east vineyard. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the rolling hills in shades of gold and amber that reminded her of the happiest days of her marriage. But instead of the familiar pang of loss, she felt something different, a sense of continuity, as if the beauty around her was not just an echo of the past, but a promise of what could still be. They had been working together more closely in recent weeks, their partnership developing naturally as the season progressed toward harvest. What had begun as an employer-employee relationship had evolved into something more collaborative, more personal. Eli still maintained his respectful distance, still called her Mom, but there were moments when the formal barriers seemed to thin, revealing glimpses of a deeper connection. It was during one of these moments, as they sat on the stone wall that bordered the vineyard, that Genevieve found herself speaking about Thomas and Michael with an openness that surprised her. "They would have loved this," she said, gesturing toward the flourishing vines that surrounded them. Thomas always said the vineyard was at its most beautiful just before harvest, when all the year's work was about to pay off. Eli listened without interrupting, his brown eyes focused on her face with an attention that made her feel truly heard. Unlike the careful sympathy most people offered when she mentioned her loss, his presence felt simply accepting, free of pity or discomfort. Michael used to help with the harvest when he was small, she continued, surprised by how easy it felt to share these memories. He was so proud to carry the baskets, even though they were nearly as big as he was. Thomas would let him stomp grapes with his bare feet, and Michael would come home purple to his knees, grinning like he'd discovered buried treasure. "Sounds like good memories," Eli said quietly. "They are." She paused, realizing that for the first time in 3 years, thinking about Thomas and Michael brought more joy than pain. "I spent so long avoiding them because they hurt too much, but lately they feel like a gift I'd forgotten I had." Eli nodded understanding, his weathered hands resting easily on the stone wall between them. "Grief's a strange thing. Fights you for a while, then settles down and starts behaving itself." There was something in his tone that suggested personal experience with loss, and Genevieve found herself wanting to know more about the man beside her. In all their conversations, he had revealed little about his own past, answering questions about his techniques and knowledge while skillfully deflecting anything more personal. "Have you lost people you loved?" she asked gently. For a moment, Eli's careful composure faltered, and she saw a flash of pain cross his features. "Most everyone, at one time or another," he said finally. "Seems like life's got a way of taking folks from you just when you need them most." The simple honesty in his words touched her deeply. She had grown accustomed to people who tried to comfort her with platitudes about God's plan or the healing power of time. Eli offered no such false comfort, just the acknowledgement that loss was real and painful and universal. "Is that why you keep moving?" she asked. "To avoid getting too attached?" Eli was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant hills where the last light was fading into purple dusk. "Maybe it started that way," he admitted, "but moving doesn't really protect you from caring, just makes it hurt different when you have to leave." There was something in the way he said, "when you have to leave," that made her heart skip. The words carried the assumption that departure was inevitable, that whatever connection was growing between them was temporary by nature. The thought filled her with an unexpected sense of loss, as if she were already mourning something she had only just begun to treasure. "Do you always have to leave?" she heard herself asking. Eli turned to look at her then, his brown eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. For a moment, the careful distance he maintained seemed to crumble, revealing something raw and vulnerable beneath. "I've never had reason to stay before," he said quietly. The words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither was quite ready to voice directly. Genevieve felt heat rise in her cheeks as she recognized the admission for what it was, not quite a declaration, but an acknowledgement that what was happening between them mattered to him as much as it did to her. They sat in silence as full darkness settled around them, both lost in their own thoughts. When Eli finally spoke, his voice was so soft she had to lean closer to hear him. "Would you like me to tell you about them?" he asked. "Thomas and Michael. What they were like." The unexpected offer brought tears to her eyes. In 3 years, no one had asked her to share her memories of her husband and son. Most people seemed to think that talking about the dead would deepen her grief, when in truth, keeping their stories locked inside had been one of the loneliest aspects of her loss. "Thomas was stubborn," she began, a smile playing at her lips. "Brilliantly, infuriatingly stubborn. When he decided something was worth doing, nothing could dissuade him. He courted me for 2 years before I agreed to marry him, showing up at my father's house every Sunday with flowers and terrible poetry that he'd written himself." Eli chuckled softly, and the warm sound encouraged her to continue. "He used to read to me in the evenings, sitting by the fire with a glass of our own wine, trying out different voices for the characters. He was particularly proud of his Shakespearean heroes, though they all sounded suspiciously like Thomas with a British accent." As she spoke, The memories flowed more freely than they had in years. She told Eli about Thomas's dreams for the vineyard, his experiments with different grape varieties, his conviction that they could produce wine as fine as any in the world. She described Michael's curiosity about everything, his gentle way with animals, his determination to follow his father's example in all things. They were planning to build a new tasting room when they got back, she said, her voice growing thick with emotion. Thomas had all these ideas about hosting wine parties, educating people about the craft. Michael was going to design stained glass windows, for Ide had real talent as an artist. Eli listened to every word, occasionally asking quiet questions that drew out more details, more stories. His attention felt like a gift, validation that Thomas and Michael's lives had mattered, that their dreams and personalities were worth preserving in memory. When she finally fell silent, emotionally drained but strangely peaceful, Eli reached into his pocket and withdrew something small and worn. In the moonlight, she could see it was a letter, the paper yellowed with age and soft from repeated handling. "I carry this," he said simply, offering it to her, "from my sister, only family I had left, and she died while I was away. Never got to say goodbye." Genevieve took the letter with reverent care, understanding the trust he was showing her. The paper was thin and fragile, covered with a woman's careful handwriting. Even in the dim light, she could see it was short, just a few lines, expressing love and hope for his safe return. "I'm sorry," she said, handing the letter back to him. "Point is," Eli said, tucking the letter away, "sometimes sharing the weight makes it easier to carry. Your Thomas and Michael, they sound like men worth remembering, worth talking about." The simple validation meant more to her than any elaborate sympathy. As they walked back toward the house, she felt as if something fundamental had shifted between them. The careful politeness was still there, but underneath it was a new understanding, a recognition that they had both known love and loss in equal measure. At the kitchen door, Eli paused and turned to face her. In the soft light spilling from the windows, his weathered features looked almost gentle. "Thank you," he said, "for trusting me with their stories." "Thank you for asking," she replied. "It's been too long since anyone wanted to hear them." As she watched him walk away toward the workers' quarters, Genevieve realized that something precious had been exchanged in their conversation. By sharing her memories of Thomas and Michael, she had honored their lives, while also taking a step toward a future that included room for new attachments, new possibilities. For the first time since the telegram arrived, she felt as if she could love again without betraying the love she had already known. The thought should have frightened her, but instead it filled her with a warmth that carried her through the night and into dreams filled with hope rather than sorrow. The silver locket lay cold against Genevieve's throat as she stood at her bedroom window, watching the pre-dawn darkness slowly give way to grey light. Inside the delicate piece of jewelry was a photograph of Michael at age 16, his young face bright with the confidence of someone who believed the world held nothing but promise. She had worn the locket every day since his death, a tangible reminder of the love she carried and the future that had been stolen from them both. But this morning, as she prepared to face another day working alongside Eli, the weight of the locket felt different heavier somehow, as if it were holding her back rather than keeping Michael close. The thought troubled her, stirring up the guilt that had become her constant companion whenever she found herself feeling happy or hopeful about anything. The past week had brought a shift in her relationship with Eli that she was struggling to understand. Their conversations had grown more personal, their shared silences more comfortable. There were moments when she caught herself watching him work, admiring the efficient grace of his movements, the way he approached each task with complete attention. And there were other moments when their hands accidentally brushed while working, when he looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret, that left her feeling unsettled in ways she hadn't experienced since Thomas's courtship. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Mrs. Ashcroft?" Martha's voice carried its usual gentle concern. "Breakfast is ready, and Jacob's here about the harvest preparations." "Coming," Genevieve called, forcing herself away from the window and the troubling direction of her thoughts. In the kitchen, she found Jacob nursing a cup of coffee while Martha bustled about preparing plates. The foreman looked up as she entered, his weathered face serious with the weight of important decisions. "Morning, ma'am," he said, rising respectfully. "We need to talk about timing for the harvest. Weather's been perfect, but that could change quick this time of year." Genevieve poured herself coffee and settled at the table, grateful for the distraction of practical concerns. "What does Eli think?" The question came automatically, and she noticed Jacob's slight smile at her immediate reference to the newest worker's opinion. "That's just it," Jacob said. "Man knows more about winemaking than he's been letting on, been asking questions about our fermentation process, our aging techniques. Makes suggestions that show real understanding of the craft." The observation didn't surprise her. In the weeks since the storm, she had noticed that Eli's knowledge seemed to extend far beyond basic farm labor. His questions were too specific, his suggestions too informed for someone who had simply picked up techniques through casual observation. "Has he said anything about his background?" she asked. Jacob shook his head. Still keeps his own counsel about personal matters, but yesterday, when we were discussing the sugar content in the Northfield grapes, he mentioned something about malolactic fermentation that made me think he's worked in a real operation before, not just helped with harvest. The mystery of Eli's past had been growing rather than diminishing as she got to know him better. His knowledge of viticulture, his obvious education beneath the cowboy exterior, his careful way of speaking all of it, suggested a history more complex than that of a simple wandering laborer. "Should I ask him directly?" she wondered aloud. "Might be better to let him tell you in his own time," Martha interjected from the stove. "Man's got his reasons for keeping quiet about where he's been. Could be they're good reasons." The housekeeper's words carried a note of warning that made Genevieve pause. What if Eli's reluctance to discuss his past stemmed from something darker than mere privacy? What if the skills and knowledge he displayed had been acquired under circumstances that would change how she saw him? The thought followed her as she went about her morning routine, checking on the various aspects of the estate's operation. But when she found Eli in the equipment barn, carefully maintaining the machinery they would need for harvest, her doubts seemed foolish. Whatever secrets he might be carrying, the man before her was dedicated, honest in his work, and gentler than anyone she had ever known. "Jacob says you have thoughts about the harvest timing," she said, settling on a wooden crate nearby to watch him work. Eli looked up from the grape press he was cleaning, his brown eyes meeting hers with their usual careful respect. "Sugar levels are just about perfect in most sections," he said. "But the weather's been too cooperative lately. Makes me nervous." "Meaning?" "Meaning when everything's going too well, nature usually has a surprise waiting." He straightened, wiping his hands on a rag. "Might want to consider starting a few days earlier than planned, just to be safe." It was exactly the kind of practical wisdom she had come to value from him, but there was something in his tone that suggested deeper concerns. "Is there something specific you're worried about?" For a moment, Eli hesitated, and she saw that familiar flicker of guardedness cross his features. "Just experience," he said finally. "Seen too many perfect seasons turn sour at the last minute." The evasion frustrated her more than usual, perhaps because their recent conversations had felt so open and honest. She found herself studying his face, searching for clues to the thoughts he kept so carefully hidden. "Eli," she said quietly, "can I ask you something?" He went still, his hands pausing in their work. "Of course, ma'am." "Where did you learn so much about winemaking? Your knowledge goes far beyond what most farm workers would have." The question hung in the air between them, and she watched as several emotions played across his weathered features: surprise, wariness, and something that might have been relief. "My father's vineyard," he said after a long pause. "Wasn't much compared to this, but it was enough to learn the basics, and I've worked other places since then, picked up what I could." It was clearly not the complete truth, but she sensed it was all he was willing to share. The realization brought with it a mixture of disappointment and understanding. Everyone had parts of their past they preferred to keep private, and she had no right to demand complete transparency from someone who was, technically, still her employee. But the careful distance in his answer reminded her of the barriers that still existed between them, barriers that seemed to grow more significant as her feelings for him deepened. She was a woman of means and social position, the owner of a successful business, a respected member of the community. He was a wandering laborer with a mysterious past and no permanent ties to anyone or anything. The disparity in their circumstances should have been enough to keep her emotions in check, but it wasn't. If anything, the mystery surrounding him only made him more intriguing, more compelling. She found herself wanting to know not just his techniques and opinions, but his dreams, his fears, his reasons for choosing a life of solitude. As if sensing her thoughts, Eli returned to his work with renewed focus, creating a subtle but unmistakable distance. The message was clear: he was not ready for the kind of personal revelation she was seeking, and perhaps never would be. That evening, as she sat in her study reviewing harvest schedules, Genevieve found herself touching the silver locket at her throat. Inside, Michael's young face smiled up at her with eternal optimism, frozen in a moment when his future had seemed limitless. For 3 years, the locket had been her anchor to the past, a way of keeping her son close and honoring his memory. But tonight, it felt like a weight dragging her backward, preventing her from moving towards something that might bring happiness and fulfillment. The internal conflict was tearing at her the guilt of potentially betraying Thomas and Michael's memory by caring for another man, the fear of opening her heart only to face loss again, the practical concerns about the appropriateness of her growing feelings for someone whose past remained largely unknown. As she prepared for bed, she made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. Tomorrow, she would speak honestly with Eli about what was happening between them. She would lay her cards on the table and see if he was willing to do the same. If he couldn't or wouldn't open up about his past, then she would accept that their relationship was destined to remain professional, no matter how much that prospect pained her. But if there was a chance, even a small one, that he might be willing to trust her with his truth, then she owed it to herself and to the memory of the love she had known to find out. The silver locket glinted in the lamplight as she set it carefully on her dressing table, and for the first time in 3 years, she fell asleep without its familiar weight against her heart. The wanted poster was old, the ink faded and the paper yellowed with age, but the face staring back at Genevieve was unmistakably Eli's. Younger, harder somehow, with eyes that held none of the gentle warmth she had grown to treasure, but undeniably the same man who had been singing lullabies to her injured foal just that morning. She stood frozen in the general store in town, the poster clutched in trembling hands, while Mrs. Henderson continued her cheerful chatter about harvest preparations and the upcoming county fair. The words on the poster seemed to burn themselves into her vision. Wanted for armed robbery, Eli Creed, 500 reward. Mrs. Ashcroft, are you feeling all right, dear? Mrs. Henderson's voice seemed to come from very far away. You've gone quite pale. Genevieve forced herself to fold the poster and slip it into her handbag, her mind racing with implications she wasn't ready to process. I'm fine, she managed. Just remembered something I need to attend to back at the vineyard. The ride home passed in a blur of dust and churning thoughts. Armed robbery. The words kept echoing in her mind, completely at odds with everything she thought she knew about Eli. The man who carved delicate vine stakes by hand, who tended wounded animals with infinite patience, who spoke to her with such respect and gentleness, could he really be capable of violence? She found him exactly where she expected in the North Vineyard, carefully testing the sugar content of the grapes in preparation for harvest. He looked up as she approached, and for a moment his smile was so open and genuine that she almost convinced herself the poster had been a mistake, a case of mistaken identity. "How was your trip to town?" he asked, setting down his testing equipment. "Get everything you needed for the harvest preparations?" Instead of answering, she withdrew the poster from her handbag and held it out to him. She watched his face carefully, searching for any sign of surprise or denial. What she saw instead was a slow, resigned acceptance that told her everything she needed to know. Eli looked at the poster for a long moment, then raised his eyes to meet hers. The careful walls he had maintained around his past seemed to crumble all at once, leaving behind a weariness that made him look older than his years. "Where did you find this?" he asked quietly. "The general store." Mrs. Henderson had it pinned to her bulletin board with other old notices. Genevieve's voice sounded strange to her own ears, hollow and distant. "Is it true?" Eli was silent for so long that she began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of shame and regret that was almost painful to hear. "Yes," he said simply, "it's true." The admission hit her like a physical blow, even though she had already known what his answer would be. All the trust she had built, all the feelings she had allowed to grow, everything seemed to crumble in the space of that single word. "When?" she heard herself ask. 7 years ago, in Colorado." Eli's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, and she could see him struggling with how much to reveal. "I was different then, angry, desperate, made choices I've regretted every day since." "What happened?" He was quiet for another long moment, his gaze fixed on the ground between them. When he looked up, his brown eyes held a pain so deep it took her breath away. "My family had a small farm outside Denver. Drought took most of our crops 3 years running, and the bank was threatening to foreclose. My father, he was a proud man, wouldn't accept help from anyone. Said we'd find a way to make it work." Eli's voice grew rougher as he continued, the words seeming to tear at his throat. "But there was no way. We lost everything, the farm, the house, even my mother's wedding ring. My parents didn't survive the winter after we lost the farm. Died in a boarding house in Denver, broken and ashamed." Genevieve felt her anger begin to waver in the face of his obvious pain, but she forced herself to remain focused. "That doesn't justify robbery." "No," he agreed immediately. "It doesn't. But I was 22 years old. My sister was sick and starving, and I'd watched my parents die of shame and poverty. When I heard about a bank shipment heading through a mountain pass money that belonged to the same institution that had destroyed my family, I convinced myself it was justice instead of crime." The raw honesty in his words was almost unbearable. She could see the young man he had been, desperate and grieving, making a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "What happened to your sister?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer from the letter he had shown her. "She died while I was running," Eli said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Pneumonia, in a charity hospital. I was hiding in the mountains, afraid to go back to town, and she died alone because of my cowardice." The weight of his confession settled between them like a stone. Genevieve found herself struggling with emotions. She couldn't untangle betrayal, sympathy, fear, and underneath it all, a love that refused to die despite everything she had just learned. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. "Because I knew this would happen," Eli replied, gesturing helplessly at the space between them. "I knew that if you learned the truth, everything would change." "And I—" He stopped, seeming to wrestle with words he couldn't quite speak. "You what?" "I fell in love with you," he said quietly, his admission carrying the weight of defeat. "With your kindness, your strength, the way you've built a life worth living despite your losses. I fell in love with the person I became when I was with you, someone decent, someone worthy of respect." The words should have filled her with joy, but instead they only deepened her anguish. How could she trust feelings built on deception? How could she separate the man she had grown to love from the criminal he had once been? "I have to ask you to leave," she said, the words cutting her own heart even as she spoke them. I can't have someone with your past working here. What would people think? What would it do to the vineyard's reputation?" Eli nodded, as if he had been expecting this outcome all along. "I understand," he said. "I'll pack my things and be gone by morning." He turned to go, then paused and looked back at her one last time. "For what it's worth," he said, "these past weeks have been the best of my life. You gave me something I thought I'd lost, forever the chance to be a better man than the one I was." As she watched him walk away, his shoulders straight, despite the weight of revelation and rejection, Genevieve felt as if something essential was being torn away from her. But she couldn't ignore the practical realities of her situation. She was a respectable widow, with a business to protect and a reputation to maintain. She couldn't afford to associate with a known criminal, no matter how much he might have changed. That evening, as she sat alone in her study with the wanted poster spread on her desk, she found herself thinking about the man she had come to know. Every interaction, every conversation, every moment of tenderness took on new significance in light of what she now knew. Had any of it been real, or had she been deceived by a performance designed to win her trust? But even as she tried to convince herself that everything had been false, she couldn't erase the memory of his gentleness with the injured foal, his careful craftsmanship with the vine stakes, his patience in teaching the younger workers. Those actions hadn't been performed for her benefit. They were simply who he was, day after day, when he thought no one was watching. The internal battle raged through the night, love warring with practical concerns, trust struggling against the stark reality of the poster that lay before her. By morning, she would have to decide whether the man Eli had become was worth the risk of embracing the man he had been. But as dawn approached, she realized that the choice might already be out of her hands. Word of Eli's past would spread quickly through the small community, and she would soon face pressure from sources far beyond her own conflicted heart. The harvest moon lantern cast dancing shadows across the vineyard as Genevieve walked the rows of vines in the pre-dawn darkness. Sleep had eluded her for the 3 days since Eli's departure, and she found herself drawn to the fields where they had worked side by side, where she had begun to believe in the possibility of a future she had never dared to imagine. The grapes hung heavy on the vines, perfect for harvest, but she felt no joy in their abundance. Everything reminded her of Elitha, carefully carved stakes that supported the growing fruit, the improved irrigation system he had designed, the cover crops he had suggested that were already showing their benefit to the soil. His influence was everywhere, woven into the very fabric of the vineyard's success. But it wasn't just his practical contributions she missed. It was the way he had made her feel alive again, the way their conversations had filled the emptiness that had defined her life since Thomas and Michael's death. In losing Eli, she felt as if she had lost not only a partner, but a part of herself she had just begun to rediscover. The sound of approaching horses broke through her melancholy thoughts. In the distance, she could see riders coming up the main road to the estate too, many riders for a casual visit, and too early in the morning for ordinary business. Something about their purposeful approach filled her with unease. She hurried back toward the house, arriving just as the group dismounted in her front yard. There were 6 men, all well-dressed and carrying themselves with the authority of those accustomed to getting their way. At their head stood a man she recognized, but had hoped never to see again, Harrison Blackwood, the land baron, who had been pressuring her to sell her vineyard for the past 2 years. Blackwood was a tall, silver-haired man with cold eyes and the kind of smile that never reached them. He owned vast tracts of land throughout the valley and had made no secret of his desire to add the Ashcroft vineyard to his holdings. His previous offers had been generous but non-negotiable, and his manner had always suggested that her refusal was merely a temporary inconvenience. "Mrs. Ashcroft," Blackwood said, tipping his hat with mock courtesy, "I hope you'll forgive the early hour, but I have some disturbing news that couldn't wait for a more civilized time." "Mr. Blackwood," she replied, keeping her voice level despite the anxiety clawing at her chest. "What brings you to my property uninvited?" "Uninvited, perhaps, but necessary," he said, his smile growing sharper. "You see, I've recently learned some very troubling information about one of your employees, a man named Eli Creed." Genevieve felt her heart sink, but she forced herself to maintain a composed expression. "Mr. Creed is no longer in my employ." "Ah, but he was," Blackwood continued, clearly enjoying her discomfort. "For several weeks, in fact. Long enough to case your property, to learn your routines, to gain your trust. He paused dramatically. Long enough to plan whatever criminal enterprise brought him here. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean," Genevieve said, though she could hear the uncertainty in her own voice. Blackwood reached into his coat and withdrew a familiar piece of paper, the same wanted poster she had found in town. "I think you know exactly what I mean. You've been harboring a known criminal, Mrs. Packus. Ashcroft, a man wanted for armed robbery, probably sent here by associates looking to target wealthy, isolated women like yourself." The accusation hit her like a slap. "That's ridiculous. Eli Creed is many things, but he's not a threat to me or anyone else." "Isn't he?" Blackwood's eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. "How well do you really know this man? What was he doing during all those private conversations you had with him? All those evenings you spent alone together in the vineyard?" The insinuation in his words was unmistakable, and Genevieve felt heat rise in her cheeks. It was clear that Blackwood had been watching her property more closely than she had realized, gathering information that could be used against her. "My relationship with my employees is my own business," she said firmly. "Not when those employees are wanted criminals," Blackwood replied. "Not when your poor judgment reflects on the entire community." He gestured to the men behind him. "I've brought along some concerned neighbors who share my worry about the safety implications of your association with Mr. Creed." Genevieve recognized several of the local landowners and businessmen who had always treated her with respect, but had never fully accepted a woman managing a large operation independently. She could see the calculation in their faces, the way they were weighing her reputation against their own interests. "Where is Creed now?" asked Samuel Morrison, who owned the neighboring cattle ranch. "Still on your property?" "I told you, he's no longer in my employ," Genevieve repeated. "But you don't know where he went," Blackwood pressed. "He could be anywhere, planning his next crime, using information he gathered while working here." The conversation was spiraling beyond her control, and Genevieve realized that Blackwood's visit wasn't really about Eli at all. It was about creating a scandal that would force her to sell her vineyard, using her association with a wanted man as leverage to destroy her reputation and isolate her from community support. "What do you want, Mr. Blackwood?" she asked directly. "I want to help you," he said, his false concern grating on her nerves. "This situation is unfortunate, but it's not irreparable. If you were to accept my offer for your property, a generous offer, I might add you could relocate somewhere your past associations wouldn't follow you. Start fresh, away from the gossip and speculation that will inevitably surround this incident." There it was, the real purpose of his visit. He was using Eli's past as a weapon against her, threatening her reputation and social standing unless she capitulated to his demands. "And if I refuse?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Blackwood's smile turned predatory. "Then I'm afraid word of your poor judgment will spread throughout the valley. People will question your ability to manage such a large operation, your fitness to operate a business that serves the public. Banks might become reluctant to extend credit to someone with such questionable associations." The threat was clear and devastating. In a community where reputation was everything, the scandal of harboring a wanted criminal could destroy everything she had worked to build and maintain. "I need time to consider," she said finally. "Of course," Blackwood agreed graciously, "but not too much time. These kinds of stories have a way of spreading quickly, and once they take hold, they become very difficult to control." After the men departed, Genevieve stood alone in her yard, feeling the weight of impossible choices pressing down on her. She could sell the vineyard and preserve her reputation, but lose everything that connected her to Thomas and Michael's memory. Or she could fight Blackwood's threats but risk destroying not only her own future, but the livelihoods of everyone who depended on the vineyard's success. As she walked back toward the house, her eyes fell on the ornate lantern that hung by her front door, the same lantern that had lit her evening conversations with Eli, that had witnessed the tentative growth of something precious between them. The sight of it filled her with a sudden, fierce determination. Blackwood was counting on her isolation, on her fear of scandal and social ostracism, but he had underestimated her strength and the depth of her convictions. She had survived the loss of her husband and son, had built a successful business as a woman alone in a man's world. She would not be bullied into abandoning everything she valued by a man who saw other people's misfortune as his opportunity. But if she was going to fight Blackwood's threats, she would need allies. And despite the pain of their parting, despite the complications his past had created, there was only one person she trusted completely to stand with her against what was coming. She needed to find Eli Creed, not because she was ready to forgive everything, but because she was finally ready to fight for what mattered most. And what mattered most wasn't just the vineyard or her reputation, it was the right to choose her own path, regardless of what others might think or say. The harvest moon lanterns swayed gently in the morning breeze, casting patterns of light and shadow that seemed to point the way forward. Whatever happened next, she would face it on her own terms, with her head held high and her heart finally free to choose love over fear. Genevieve found Eli at the abandoned mining camp 15 miles north of Willow Ridge, exactly where Jakob had said he might be. The old foreman had been reluctant to share the information, worried about his employer's safety, but her determination had finally convinced him that she knew what she was doing. The camp was a collection of weathered buildings left over from the gold rush days, now serving as temporary shelter for drifters and men avoiding attention. Eli was sitting alone by a small fire, his few possessions packed in a worn saddlebag beside him. When he saw her approaching on horseback, his face showed a mixture of surprise, hope, and carefully guarded wariness. "Genevieve," he said, rising to his feet, "you shouldn't be here. It's not safe for a woman alone." "I'm not alone," she replied, dismounting and gesturing toward the rifle secured to her saddle, her late husband's Winchester, which she had learned to use during the uncertain days after his death. "And I'm not the one in danger." She told him about Blackwood's visit, about the threats and ultimatums, about the impossible choice between her reputation and her independence. As she spoke, she watched Eli's expression grow darker, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "He's using me to get to you," Eli said when she finished. "Using my past as a weapon. I should have left the territory entirely, should have known this would happen." "But you didn't," she said firmly, "and now we have to deal with what is, not what should have been." Eli shook his head, his brown eyes filled with self-recrimination. "There's no we in this, Genevieve. This is my fault, my responsibility. You need to take Blackwood's offer and get as far away from this mess as possible." "No." The word came out with more force than she had intended, causing Eli to step back in surprise. "I won't be bullied into abandoning everything I've built because of other people's fears and prejudices." "You don't understand," Eli insisted. "Men like Blackwood don't stop at threats. If he can't get what he wants through intimidation, he'll escalate. You could be in real danger." "Then help me fight him," she said, moving closer until she was standing directly in front of him. "Help me protect what matters." For a moment, hope flickered across his weathered features, but then the walls came back up, stronger than before. "I can't. Don't you see? My presence makes everything worse. As long as I'm anywhere near you, Blackwood has ammunition to use against you. And if you disappear, he wins without a fight," Genevieve countered. "He gets my land and I lose everything that connects me to the life Thomas and I built together." They stood facing each other in the dying light of his campfire, two people who had found something precious together but were being pulled apart by forces beyond their control. The silence stretched between them, filled with all the words they couldn't seem to find. Finally, Eli spoke, his voice soft with resignation. "What are you asking me to do?" "Come back," she said simply. "Face this with me. Show the community that you're not the man you used to be. And if they don't believe it, if they see only the criminal on that poster." Genevieve reached into her coat and withdrew something that made Eli's eyes widen with surprise. The wanted poster, but now torn cleanly in half. "Then we'll prove them wrong," she said, letting the pieces flutter to the ground. "Together." But even as she spoke the words, she could see in Eli's face that he wasn't convinced. The weight of his past, the shame of his choices, the fear of bringing more trouble to the woman he loved, all of it was written in the lines around his eyes, the set of his shoulders. "Genevieve," he said quietly, "there's something else you need to know. Something that makes this even more complicated." Her heart sank at the gravity in his tone. "What?" "Blackwood knows about my past because someone told him. Someone who's been watching me, following me." Eli's jaw tightened. "My old partner from that robbery 7 years ago, a man named Dutch Henley. He's here, in the valley, and he's not interested in letting me start over with a clean slate." The revelation hit her like a physical blow. It was one thing to deal with Blackwood's threats and the community's judgment, but the prospect of facing an actual criminal, someone with violent intentions, was terrifying in ways she hadn't anticipated. "What does he want?" she managed to ask. "Money, most likely. Maybe revenge for the way things ended between us." Eli's hands moved unconsciously to check the gun at his hip, a gesture that reminded her forcefully of the dangerous life he had once lived. Dutch was always the dangerous one, the one who enjoyed the violence more than the profit. "I broke away from him after the robbery, tried to go straight. He's never forgiven me for that." The implications were staggering. Not only was her reputation at stake, but her actual safety might be threatened by men who played by rules she didn't understand. "All the more reason for you to come back," she heard herself saying, surprising them both. "If this Dutch is as dangerous as you say, I need someone I can trust, watching out for me." Eli stared at her as if she had taken leave of her senses. "You want me to come back so I can protect you from the criminal associates my presence attracted in the first place?" "I want you to come back because you're the only person I trust completely," she said, finally speaking the truth that had been growing in her heart, despite everything. "Because whatever you were 7 years ago, I know who you are now, and the man you are now would never let harm come to someone under his protection." The words hung in the air between them, a declaration that went far beyond the practical concerns of her situation. She was asking him to trust her judgment of his character, to believe that redemption was possible, that the past didn't have to define the future. When Eli finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "If I come back, if we face this together, there's no going back to the way things were. Everyone will know about us, about what we mean to each other." "Good," she said firmly. "I'm tired of hiding from what I feel, tired of letting other people's opinions dictate my choices." As they stood in the flickering firelight, with danger gathering around them and impossible odds stacked against their future, Genevieve felt something she hadn't experienced since before the telegram that changed her life: absolute certainty about what she wanted. She wanted Eli, wanted the life they could build together, wanted to fight for the right to choose love over fear. The battle that lay ahead would test everything they believed about themselves and each other. But for the first time since discovering the wanted poster, she felt ready to face whatever came next, as long as she didn't have to face it alone. The confrontation came at dawn, just as Genevieve and Eli had expected. They heard the riders approaching, while the morning mist still clung to the vineyard rows, and by the time Blackwood's group reached the main yard, both of them were waiting on the front porch, Genevieve with Thomas's Winchester across her lap, Eli standing beside her with the quiet alertness of a man prepared for violence. But it wasn't just Blackwood this time. Behind him rode a dozen men, some she recognized as his usual associates, others who had the hard look of hired guns. And among them, she spotted a face that made Eli's jaw tighten, a lean, scarred man with cold eyes, who could only be Dutch Henley. "Mrs. Ashcroft," Blackwood called out, his voice carrying false concern. "I see you've made your choice about the company you keep. How unfortunate." "The only unfortunate thing here is your trespass on my property," Genevieve replied, her voice steady despite the fear racing through her veins. "You and your men need to leave. Now." Blackwood's smile was razor-sharp. "I'm afraid that's not possible. You see, we have it on good authority that you're harboring not just one criminal, but possibly several. Mr. Henley here has some very interesting stories about your friend Creed." Dutch Henley urged his horse forward, his gaze fixed on Eli with undisguised malice. "Hello, partner," he drawled. "Been a long time." "Not long enough," Eli replied quietly, his hand resting near his gun, but not yet drawing it. Now, Dutch continued, is that any way to greet an old friend, especially one who's come all this way to collect what's owed? The tension in the yard was palpable, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Genevieve could feel the violence building, could see it in the way the men shifted in their saddles, hands moving toward weapons. That's when she heard it, the sound of more horses approaching from the direction of town. As the riders came into view, her heart leaped with surprise and gratitude. Jacob led the group, followed by Martha's husband Tom, several of the vineyard workers, and to her amazement, nearly a dozen neighbors and townspeople. Samuel Morrison, the cattle rancher who had been with Blackwood just days before, rode at the front of the group. When he reached the yard, he dismounted and walked deliberately to stand beside Genevieve's porch. "Morning, Mrs. Ashcroft," he said, tipping his hat. "Heard you might be having some trouble." "Mr. Morrison," she replied, hardly daring to believe what she was seeing. "What brings you here?" "Well," Morrison said, his weathered face serious, "seems word got around about Mr. Blackwood's visit the other day. And some of us got to thinking about what we actually know versus what we've been told." Behind him, the other townspeople were dismounting and forming a loose semicircle around Blackwood's men. The land baron's expression had shifted from confident aggression to wary calculation. "What we know," Morrison continued, raising his voice so everyone could hear, "is that Eli Creed showed up at your place and worked harder than any man we've seen. Fixed things, improved things, treated everyone with respect. What we know is that he helped save your harvest during that storm, risked his own safety for your property." An older woman Genevieve recognized as the schoolteacher stepped forward. "What we know is that he's been nothing but polite and helpful every time any of us have encountered him. And what we don't know is why Mr. Blackwood is so eager to paint him as a threat." Blackwood's face was flushing red with anger and embarrassment. "This man is a wanted criminal, the poster clearly shows." "The poster shows a crime from 7 years ago," interrupted Dr. Patterson, the town physician. "But I've been practicing medicine for 30 years, and I know something about redemption and second chances. Sometimes a man's actions in the present matter more than his mistakes in the past." Dutch Henley was looking increasingly agitated as he watched his advantage slip away. "You people don't know what you're dealing with," he snarled. "Eli Creed is a killer and a thief, and he's got you all fooled." "The only person I see making threats here is you," said Martha, stepping out from behind the crowd with her usual no-nonsense demeanor. "Mrs. Ashcroft has been good to this community, employed our sons and daughters, contributed to our prosperity. If she says Mr. Creed is a good man, that's enough for us." The bell in the vineyard's old watchtower began to ring. Then Jacob had climbed up and was pulling the rope with steady determination. The sound echoed across the valley, clear and defiant, calling the community together, just as it had during harvest celebrations and times of crisis for generations. "That bell," Genevieve said, her voice carrying new strength, "has called this community together for 40 years. It rang when my husband and son left for the war, and it rang when we got word they wouldn't be coming home. It's ringing now because this is our home, and we don't let bullies and criminals decide who belongs here." She stood then, the Winchester cradled in her arms, her bearing proud and unafraid. "Mr. Blackwood, you and your men have 5 minutes to leave my property. After that, I'll consider you trespassers and act accordingly." Dutch Henley's hand moved toward his gun, but he stopped when he realized he was facing not just Eli, but an entire community united against outside threats. The odds had shifted dramatically, and even his reckless nature couldn't ignore the mathematics of the situation. "This isn't over," he said to Eli, his voice thick with frustrated rage. "Yes, it is," Eli replied quietly. "I'm not the man I was 7 years ago, Dutch, and this isn't the place for your kind of trouble." Blackwood looked around at the determined faces surrounding him, calculating whether he could salvage anything from the situation. But the community's solidarity was unmistakable, and his threats had clearly backfired. "You're making a mistake," he said finally, but the bluster had gone out of his voice. "The only mistake," Genevieve replied. would be letting fear keep us from protecting what we've built together. As Blackwood and his men rode away, defeated and humiliated, the community erupted in cheers. The vineyard bell continued to ring, a celebration of unity and defiance that could be heard for miles across the valley. Genevieve felt Eli's hand slip into hers, warm and strong and steady. For the first time since the wanted poster had shattered her world, she felt truly safe, not because the danger had passed, but because she was no longer facing it alone. 6 months later, as the spring sun warmed the newly planted vines, Genevieve stood in the same spot where she had once watched Eli work with such careful attention to detail. But now she wore a simple ring made from twisted vineyard wire, the same wire Eli had shaped with his own hands on a quiet evening when words hadn't seemed adequate to express what they meant to each other. The wedding had been small but perfect, held in the vineyard under the oak trees that bordered the property. Dr. Patterson had performed the ceremony, with Martha crying happily into her handkerchief and Jakob beaming with the satisfaction of a man who had seen his instincts about people proven correct. The entire community had attended, bringing food and music, and the kind of joy that comes from witnessing love triumph over adversity. Blackwood had never returned to Willow Ridge after his humiliating defeat. Word had spread throughout the territory about his failed attempt to intimidate a respected widow, and his reputation for getting what he wanted through threats had been permanently damaged. Dutch Henley had disappeared entirely, apparently deciding that pursuing his vendetta wasn't worth facing an entire community united against him. The vineyard itself had never been more prosperous. Eli's innovations and careful attention to the land had resulted in the best harvest in the estate's history, and orders for their wine were coming in from as far away as San Francisco. More importantly, the work felt meaningful again, filled with the sense of shared purpose that had been missing since Thomas's death. "You're thinking about something serious," Eli observed, coming up behind her and slipping his arms around her waist. Even after months of marriage, his touch still sent warmth spreading through her chest. "Just remembering," she said, leaning back against his solid presence. "Thinking about how different everything is now." "Different how?" She turned in his arms to face him, noting how the worry lines around his eyes had softened, how his smile came easier now. "I spent 3 years believing that my life was over, that the best I could hope for was to maintain what Thomas and I had built. I never imagined I could have something new, something that honored the past while still moving toward the future." Eli's expression grew serious, as it always did when she spoke about her late husband and son. In the early days of their relationship, he had worried about competing with ghosts, but time had taught him that love didn't have to be exclusive or finite. Her love for Thomas and Michael hadn't diminished her capacity to love him. If anything, it had deepened her appreciation for the precious nature of human connection. "Do you think they would approve?" he asked, the question that still sometimes haunted his quieter moments. "I think," she said carefully, "that Thomas would appreciate how hard you work and how much you respect the land he loved. I think Michael would be fascinated by your stories and would want you to teach him to carve those vine stakes." She paused, then added more softly, "And I think they would both be happy that I'm not alone anymore." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the bustle of activity around the estate. The spring planting was in full swing, with workers moving efficiently through the rows under Eli's patient supervision. He had proven to be not just a skilled laborer, but a natural leader, someone the other workers looked to for guidance and respected for his fairness. "Mrs. Creed." They turned to see young Timothy Morrison, Samuel's 15-year-old son, approaching with the eager expression that usually meant he had questions about some aspect of vineyard management. Over the winter, he had become Eli's shadow, absorbing everything he could learn about the craft of winemaking. "Yes, Tim," Genevieve replied, still adjusting to her new name, but finding she liked the sound of it. "My father sent me to ask if you and Mr. Creed would be attending the spring social next week. The planning committee wants to know how many people to expect." "We'll be there," Eli answered before Genevieve could respond. In the early months after their confrontation with Blackwood, he had been reluctant to appear at public gatherings, still self-conscious about his past. But the community's acceptance had gradually convinced him that he truly belonged among them. After Tim departed with their answer, Genevieve found herself thinking about the changes the past year had brought to more than just her own life. The vineyard had become a gathering place for the community in ways it had never been before, with Eli's easy manner and genuine interest in others drawing people who had previously kept their distance. Martha had organized regular dinners for the workers and their families, creating a sense of extended community that enriched everyone involved. Jacob had begun training Timothy and two other young men in the finer points of viticulture, ensuring that the knowledge would be passed on to the next generation. Even the injured foal that had first shown her Eli's gentle nature had grown into a beautiful mare who now helped with the lighter work around the estate. "I have something to show you," Eli said, taking her hand and leading her toward the equipment barn. "Been working on it in the evenings." Inside the barn, covered with a worn tarp, sat something roughly the size and shape of a piece of furniture. When Eli pulled away the covering, Genevieve gasped in delight. It was a beautiful wooden desk, crafted from local oak, with the same attention to detail she had seen in his vine stakes. The surface was smooth as silk, and delicate carvings around the edges depicted grapevines intertwined with Rosacea favorite flower. "It's for the new tasting room," Eli explained, his cheeks slightly flushed with the embarrassment of someone unused to receiving praise for artistic work. "Thought you might like something special for when visitors come to sample the wine." The tasting room had been Thomas and Michael's dream, one that she had never found the courage to pursue alone. But with Eli's encouragement and the community's support, they had finally broken ground on the project the previous month. It would be a place where people could come to appreciate not just their wine, but the history and craft that went into its creation. "It's perfect," she said, running her hands over the smooth wood. "More beautiful than anything we could have bought." "There's something else," Eli said, his voice carrying a note of nervous excitement. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden box, also carved from oak. Inside, nestled in a bed of soft cloth, was a pair of wine glasses, unlike any she had ever seen. The glasses were delicate but sturdy, their bowls perfectly shaped for aerating wine. But what made them extraordinary were the stems, each one carved from a single piece of wood, shaped into miniature grapevines, complete with tiny leaves and clusters of fruit. "I thought," Eli said hesitantly, "that when we open the tasting room, we could use these for special occasions, for people who really appreciate what we're trying to do here." Genevieve lifted one of the glasses, marveling at the incredible skill required to create something so delicate and beautiful. In that moment, she understood that this was Eli's way of claiming a place not just in her life, but in the legacy of the vineyard itself. These glasses would be used for decades, would be part of celebrations and commemorations she couldn't yet imagine. "They're works of art," she said, meaning every word. "Thomas would have been amazed by your skill." As they stood together in the barn, surrounded by the tools and equipment that supported their shared work, Genevieve felt a deep sense of completion. She had mourned her losses, faced her fears, and chosen love over safety. The future stretched ahead of them, full of possibilities neither had dared to imagine when they first met. The vineyard bell began to ring, calling them to the midday meal that Martha had prepared for the workers. As they walked hand in hand toward the house, Genevieve realized that the sound no longer reminded her of endings of Thomas and Michael leaving for war, of loss and grief and solitary struggle. Now the bell spoke of continuity, of community, of the daily rhythms of a life built on love and shared purpose. It was the sound of home, richer and more complex than she had ever imagined possible, but rooted in the same soil that had nurtured generations of dreams. Behind them, the carved wineglasses caught the afternoon light, waiting for the celebrations yet to come. Ahead of them, the newly planted vines reached toward the sun, carrying the promise of harvests that would sustain not just their family, but the community that had chosen to embrace them both. Some love stories end with dramatic gestures and passionate declarations, But the truest ones, Genevieve had learned, are built from small daily choices, the decision to trust, to forgive, to keep building even when the foundation has been shaken. They are made from morning conversations over coffee, from shared labor in sun and rain, from the quiet courage to believe that happiness can bloom again in soil that has known both grief and joy. As the vineyard bell faded into silence, she squeezed Eli's hand and felt him squeeze back, a simple gesture that said everything about the life they had chosen to build together, one careful day at a time.